All right, welcome back. Today we're diving into something really cool. We're looking at a source that takes one of the most famous texts in the world and reads it in a completely new way. We're not talking about it as just, moral poetry. No, this interpretation sees it as something way more fundamental, something stranger. It's asking us to look at this ancient wisdom through the lens of modern physics. Yep, you heard that right. And this is where it all starts, with this just incredibly provocative question. The source material basically throws this out there and says, hold on a second. It wants us to consider this really wild possibility. What if this ancient text isn't just about how to be a good person? What if it's actually describing the deep, fundamental architecture of reality itself, like a kind of sacred, interconnected pattern that literally emerges from our choices and our actions? So that brings us to the core idea here. The whole argument is that the Sermon on the Mount isn't just a list of ethical guidelines, not at all. It's supposedly a description of reality's fundamental quantum rules. Think of it like a moral code, yeah, but a code for how to actually participate in the very fabric of the universe. So you've got these two very different ways of looking at it, right? On one side, you have the classical view we all know. It's a collection of beautiful poems, maybe some utopian ideals. But this quantum view, it just flips the whole thing on its head. It says it's not about these far-off ideals you're supposed to strive for. Nope, it's more like an instruction manual, a guide for how to align yourself with the divine, energetic field that's already here, right now. And this leads to a pretty wild conclusion. If this is true, then morality stops being just a list of do's and don'ts. It becomes a kind of physics. Your actions, your intentions, they're not just these private, personal choices anymore. In this framework, they're actual interactions that directly influence the field all around you. That's a huge shift.
Okay, so you're probably wondering, how does this actually work, like in practice? Well, the source starts by taking a huge concept from quantum physics, entanglement, and applies it not just to tiny particles, but to us, to people.
So let's do a quick refresher on what that means. Quantum entanglement is that really weird, spooky thing where two particles get linked together. And once they're linked, whatever happens to one of them instantly affects the other one. And I mean instantly, no matter how far apart they are, across the room or across the galaxy. It's like they're still part of the same system.
Okay, and here's where this gets really interesting. The source takes that idea and applies it to something like forgiveness. We usually think of forgiveness as this transaction, right? Between two totally separate people. But in this quantum view, it's not a transaction, it's a field correction. The idea is, if we're all entangled in some way, forgiving someone isn't just for them. It's actually you recalibrating the entire system that you both belong to.
And suddenly this verse looks totally different. The source argues this isn't about some promise of a reward you get later in the afterlife. It's a statement of physics happening right now. By being merciful, you are already changing the entangled field in a way that makes mercy flow back to you. It's immediate. It's reciprocal.
And this idea completely rereads the entire Beatitudes. The blessed people aren't just, good people waiting for a prize down the line. In this view, they're in specific entangled states. Being meek or a peacemaker, that is the reward. It's not something you get later. It's a description of your state right now, because it means you're already aligned, already resonating with this divine field.
All right, let's move on to the next piece of this puzzle. And honestly, this is one of the most mind-bending ideas in all of quantum mechanics. Superposition, and this crazy idea that just by looking at something, we can fundamentally change reality.
So what is superposition? Basically, it means a quantum particle exists in all of its possible states at the exact same time. It's like a blurry wave of every possibility. But then, and this is the weird part, the moment we look at it, the moment we measure it, that wave of possibilities collapses into just one single definite reality.
So how does this apply to the sermon? Well, the source argues that all those famous paradoxes, the poor are rich, the last will be first, they're actually sacred superpositions. The poor are rich, the last are first. They're both true at the same time. They're not contradictions, they're coexisting truths, living in an uncollapsed quantum state.
And this verse is held up as a perfect example of this observer effect, but applied to morality. It's suggesting that the very act of observation, your gaze, what you're looking at and how you're looking at it, is an incredibly powerful force that can actually collapse reality into a specific shape.
And here's the key insight the source pulls from this. A lustful look, in this view, isn't just some private thought you have in your head.
It's an act of measurement. It's an act that takes the divine potential of another person, their superposition of possibilities, and collapses it down into just one thing, an object. The Source even calls this a kind of informational violence. Wow. Even prayer gets a quantum makeover here. It's not about passive wishing or just hoping for the best. It's presented as this active, three-step quantum process. You ask to kick off a measurement. You seek to orient yourself, to entangle with the result you want. And you knock, to literally interact with reality's threshold, to force that collapse into being.
Okay, so if these quantum states of being are so powerful and important, there has to be a threat, right? Something that works against them. And according to the Source, that danger is a force called decoherence.
What is decoherence? Well, it's basically the reason our everyday world looks so solid and predictable, and not like a blurry quantum mess. It's the constant chatter, the constant interaction with the environment that forces all those quantum possibilities to collapse down into the single, classical reality we all experience. You could almost say it's the enemy of the pure quantum state. And this framework gives us a totally new way to look at one of the most difficult commands in the whole sermon. Be perfect. I mean, that sounds impossible, right? But instead of this idea of moral flawlessness, of never making a single mistake, the Source suggests that perfection really means maintaining coherence. It's about staying in that pure, uncollapsed quantum state, staying in phase with the divine.
So what causes this moral decoherence? Well, the Source points to these specific things and calls them environmental noise. Things like judging other people, worrying all the time about money or food, holding on to anger, keeping grudges. These aren't just bad behaviors. In this view, they are literal forces that knock your soul out of its divine superposition state and collapse it into a rigid, predictable, classical one.
So this all leads us to that famous ending, right? The story about the two builders. And it really boils down to this fundamental question. How do you build a life that can actually withstand this constant, relentless pressure to collapse? First, the Source gives us this really powerful metaphor. That storm, the one that comes and beats against both houses, it's not just random trouble or tragedy. It is the decoherence pressure of the world. It's that relentless, constant force trying to break down your spiritual coherence.
And that leaves us with two choices for our foundation. Building on sand? That's a life built on disconnected actions, on what other people think of you, on external approval. It has no real internal stability, so when the pressure hits, it just collapses. But building on rock? That means your foundation is that practice coherence we've been talking about. Your life is built to resonate. It's constructed in a way that when that storm of decoherence hits, and it will hit, your internal structure actually holds firm.
So, in the end, the Source concludes that the entire Sermon on the Mount isn't just a list of rules you're supposed to follow. It's something much more profound. It's an architectural blueprint for building a truly resilient soul, a plan for a life that is phase-locked to the divine, a life that can maintain its quantum integrity no matter what the world decides to throw at it.
And that leaves us with one last, really provocative thought to chew on. What if we've been looking at our own lives all wrong? What if your life isn't so much a story that you write chapter by chapter, but more like a waveform that you tune? It's less about the narrative and more about the fundamental frequency you choose to resonate with. Something to think about.